Chapter 6. The Fire of the Desert. Don't ignore whispers and rustling of grass. Don't ignore sparks carried by the wind. Conflagration is a moment, and a mindless anger. Only ashen grey ruins will remain, and only pain will burn without end. Kyreni's Book of Sayings. They said she came from the desert, straight from the waterless hell of Nahelzim, where there is nothing but rocks, sand, and clumps of iron grass. A solitary woman, clad in loose red cloak, the kind worn in the desert, with her face hidden beneath a deep hood. A prophetess who proclaimed that she would set the world on fire. She preached that she had been sent by the ancient goddess of Amidrash, the underground mother, goddess whom the people had turned away from. At least, that's how it appeared in the rumors whispered in the squares and the marketplaces across the empire. It happened during an exceptionally hot, dry summer. The sky burned, rivers in the southern provinces dried up, and the earth cracked and formed a hard crust. Day after day, the heat rose, and not a drop of rain had fallen in the central provinces since spring. My father summoned the wise ones to him, but I never heard what they told him. I suspect it wasn't anything important. There are some things that even the best ruler can do little about, such as drought, flood, or plague. Even the wisest emperor cannot stop a hurricane, and even the most battle-hardened army cannot defeat a storm. That's just the way it is. At that time, I was beginning to grow into a young man. My eldest brother, Kimirzil, had passed away, and I had grown accustomed to the idea of a world that looked different. I would sometimes visit his grave in the Garden of Silence and light incense in a stone bowl adorned with a relief of a host, but I didn't think about him often. I had grown accustomed. Besides, my teacher didn't give me much time for reflection. While I treated the constant exercises and discipline we were subjected to in the House of Steel as a burden that had to be endured, as I grew older, I began to have additional duties. My brother and two sisters would spend their time in the Chamber of Learning, poring over scrolls and listening to the teacher. I, however, was often living in the company of Leverbelt. We would navigate the secret stone corridors all the way to the palace. Before, I had almost never left the village of the clouds. Its garden and houses were my entire world. The endless wall and the walls of a tiger palace meant as much to me as the horizon did to someone else. During festivities and ceremonies, we were sometimes taken to watch the mysteries from behind the columns of a tiger hall, or to observe the parades of dancers in the Plaza of 1,000 Horses in front of the palace. Occasionally, we were led to the state temple, but these were all exotic excursions, much like the rare trips to the Eagle Palace in the Sea Mountains. My whole knowledge of the world came from scrolls and stories. I knew as much about the bazaars and streets of Maranhar, which I could have visited right after breakfast, as I did about the steppes of Kabir, the mountain cities of Sagar, or the rivers and canals of Yamarkand. The only common folk I ever saw were the palace gardeners, servants and slaves. Well fed and healthy, they seemed perfectly content, and I had assumed that all the inhabitants of the empire, indeed all the people in the world, looked the same. But as I began to grow, that had to change. Leverbelt took me to the palace to observe meetings and watch from hiding as emissaries arrived to see my father. Every morning I had to listen to reports on the state of the nation. I learned about storms, rebellions, bushels of grain and durra, ships, taxes, unrest, and religious disputes. Leverbelt relentlessly quizzed me, checking if I understood and remembered all these things. He made me explain what I would do in this or that situation and did not tolerate vague, thoughtless answers. I had to spend entire days in endless discussions. A simple answer like, I would move a regiment of infantry to Kabzegar, or I would raise the tax by 5 dirhams per stall, was never enough. More how and why always followed. I had to come up with solutions and defend them. It exhausted me more than the martial arts training. Another change in my life was that the time for stick fighting had ended for good. I was given my own sword, knife, bow, and spear. Simple and inexpensive, like the ones issued to the army, with blades of good steel, but mounted in ordinary bone and wood. The bruises and contusions that had adorned me before were replaced by shallow scars and cuts. Once I asked Levabelt when I might find some respite.
An easy day was yesterday,
He replied with a laugh.
It will be like this for the rest of your life. Remember that, Ohimon.
It wasn't easy to focus on all this because I too began to change, and it seemed to happen overnight. One day, my entire world was filled with a pursuit of a little freedom so I could run through the garden, shoot arrows at baskets, or swim in the lake. Suddenly, it turned out that there were nothing more fascinating to me than the moment when the chambermaid Hafma stood in light of the terrace and outline of her body was clearly visible through her robe. When my teacher Aina explained the writings of the ancient leaders and taught the principle of effective politics, all I could see was her neck, specifically the spot on the nape where her hair was pinned up high. I listened as she explained the rules of trade, its tricks and secrets, but I would fall asleep with my eyes open, unable to take my gaze off the mysterious, shadowed spot between her breasts, visible between the fastenings of her tunic. We often played a game that was an exercise in trading skills. It was called Tarbis. I loved playing it, but at some point I kept losing. I cared less about whether I would bargain a rare black stone from Aina and what deal I would throw, than about whether I would catch a glimpse of her thigh or the inside of her foot through the slit in her skirt. I knew that I was growing up and starting to become a man, but I never imagined it would be like a wildfire spreading across the steppe. I thought I would desire woman the way I desire to have my own horse or watch acrobats perform. Just a whim that, if impossible to fulfill, would be easy to ignore and suppress. I didn't understand those passionate emotions I had read about in the poets' works. I didn't think it would feel like a homesickness that consumed me, a fever and thirst in the middle of a desert all at once. I knew I was destined to marry one of the princesses from the ancient Amitrash families, perhaps the daughter of a ruler from some foreign land. That, in addition, I would have several concubines. But I knew I would not choose any of them according to the dictates of my heart, and that, in principle, there was no way for Aina, who was my teacher, to be one of them. And so the entire country was dying of thirst, and so was I. But while the people and animals longed for water, I was withering away, yearning for Aina's body. My father ordered fodder to be distributed to the cattle and water to be brought from the rivers to some of the cities. Barrels were brought in from the border provinces and filled with water, which traveled days before being rationed out to the people, 1 bucket per day. The Asil, the river that flowed through the capital, looked like a stream, lazily winding its way through a wide band of sun-baked, cracked mud. I wouldn't remember Aina's face as soon as she was out of sight. I knew she had dark blue, slightly almond-shaped eyes and hair that curled into rings and spirals the color of night sky in summer, black with a hint of blue. I remembered her nose, narrow like a knife, and her full lips with slightly drooping corners. But these were just words. I couldn't picture them in my mind, no matter how hard I tried. It felt as if my teacher's face was hidden behind a veil, and at any moment I would see it, but as soon as I imagined her eyes, her lips would disappear, and when I remembered her hair, her entire face would vanish. I would lie awake at night, clutching the iron wishing ball that I had received from Lodowego. A ball I had become so accustomed to that whenever I felt bad, I would reach for it instinctively. Sometimes I wouldn't fall asleep until it slipped from my hand. The wells along the trade routes had to be guarded by the army to prevent them from being drained dry. The wagons loaded with barrels also had to travel under the protection of cavalry. The durra in the fields withered, and the ears of corn were no larger than a child's fist. I tried to quench my burning desire and focus on something else, but even learning had become monotonous. Day after day, the palace lived only for rain, water, and grain. Strategic reserves were constantly being counted, and everyone pondered how the country would survive until next year. Because, like everyone else, I couldn't find any good advice, I felt weary of it all. More and more often, we received disturbing reports from the commanders of military outposts, from city guards, from officials and spies. One phrase kept repeating, whispered in bazaars, roadside inns, stations and squares. The wrath of the gods. It wasn't unusual for people to suspect divine intervention when things were wrong. But in my father's empire, rumors about the old gods were truly dangerous and political in every way. I would have to explain what a midrash was like in the days when my grandfather sat on the tiger throne. I'll gradually tell about it, but not just yet. Suffice to say that when people whispered about the wrath of the gods in the marketplaces, they meant the old gods, the great underground mother and her servants, Azina, to whom dozens of blood sacrifices of prisoners were made at every harvest, the two moon brothers, who were the patrons of men, the code of the earth, which regulated every step a person took from birth to death. In that Amitrash, people owned almost nothing. Everything was consecrated to the gods, and everything belonged to them. Of course, the gods were seen as rarely then as they are now or everywhere else. However, the Amitrash believed that they were people owned by Underground Mother and that all conquests were about reclaiming her heritage. They believed that when they conquered the whole world and offered it to the Mother, the Golden Age would return, an age of abundance, happiness, and love. A time when people had no gender and everything and everyone was united. Then the world, split in two, would be made whole again. There would be no day and night, no man and woman, no good and evil, only the harmony of unity. We, the Kiranese, believe in something else. In the arduous journey up the mountain towards enlightenment and harmony with the Creator. We believe there are different paths, and many of them, those that climb up the mountain through the struggle to be just, merciful, free and good, are the right ones. But each person walks alone and must choose their own path. The gods, strange beings who appear on earth, also follow this path, just like other creatures. Some ascend the mountain, while others lose their way, just like humans, but they don't matter. And we forced Amitrash to accept this philosophy. Gradually, step by step, we allowed people to marry, live together, build homes, accumulate property, and raise their own children. We allowed them to climb the mountain and choose their paths. We allowed them to remember the old languages and customs of the lands they came from before they were conquered by the empire. We allowed them to bow to the old gods as long as they remained obedient to our laws and the tiger throne. But then the drought came, bringing hunger and disease, and in the bazaars, people began to whisper about the wrath of the gods. the old gods, the ones who had been offended, and about a prophetess known as the Fire of the Desert, powerful woman who hid her face under a hood and who was said to have been sent by the angered underground mother who was scourging the disobedient people with the fire of a drought.